right, let's kick it off. Welcome to today's webinar. We have gathered a group of experts today on a very important topic, which is managing forced labor risks in a high-pressure landscape in global supply chains. I will say a few logistical words in the beginning. So the webinar is being recorded, and we will share the slides and the recording with you afterwards. We will also have time at the end for Q&A. There's a Q&A section that you will see as part of your webinar in Zoom, where you can already ask questions throughout the webinar. And at least at the end, we will try to get to all of your questions. So without much further ado, let's start with the webinar. Forced labor is a topic of global importance and magnitude for supply chains. According to estimates from the ILO, there's more than 27 million individuals employed in forced labor conditions worldwide. And for that reason, forced labor is one of the most important human rights, also in focus, and has been enshrined in both voluntary international frameworks, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, but also the UNGPs, and has since then, over the last couple of years, also been enshrined and anchored into more and more either national due diligence legislations, which you see on the right-hand side here, such as the German Supply Chain Act, the Norwegian Transparency Act, the French Loi de Vigilance. Also the CSDDD covers the topic of forced labor as one of the human rights. And then we have also a few forced labor specific regulations. The UK Modern Slavery Act as the first ones, then the UFLPA, which came into force, I believe it was 2021, 2022 in the US. The Canadian Modern Slavery Act. We also have an Australian one, and more recently passed at the end of 2024, the EU Forced Labor Regulation, which is then applicable in 2027. And that is actually the lead-in for the first part of this webinar, for which I'm very excited to introduce both Markus Löning and Samira Rafaela. Markus, you know from many previous webinars, he's the founder and managing director of Löning Human Rights and has consulted many businesses worldwide on due diligence in supply chains. And Samira Rafaela is and has served as a member of the European Parliament for the Renew fraction, and as such was rapporteur for the forced labor regulation. And today, Samira holds a position as senior advisor for the Center of Strategic and International Studies. And I would like to hand over now to Markus and Samira for a conversation on the EU forced labor regulation and forced labor risks in general. Markus, over to you.
That's a problem when you mute yourself at the beginning. So thank you very much, Harald, and welcome, Samira. Great speaking to you. I was wondering whether we could explore a bit the history also of the EU forced labor regulation. So you've been at the forefront while you were a member of the European Parliament. You've been pushing for this law. Renew Group has been pushing for this law. Could you explain why you did this? What were the thoughts behind it? What is it you saw, or where you saw this is a need to regulate?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak about the EU forced labor regulation. So we expect with the EU forced labor regulation that we can finally tackle and target the very perverse incentives that nowadays still causes forced labor to happen. The European Union needs to be an important player in the world when it comes to protecting human rights. And obviously forced labor is a huge problem. So years ago, when I was a member of the European Parliament, we continued to having the debate about how we could effectively tackle forced labor. So it's been an ongoing debate even before I entered the European Parliament. But in the mandate of 2019 to 2024, we really had a breakthrough. As you might know, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was back then negotiated. Unfortunately, it's again being negotiated. But as a result of the CSDDD, we could also have the debate specifically about forced labor. We said the CSDDD will probably not be enough. So a group of MEPs, I was part of that, said we really need a specific instrument to tackle forced labor. Luckily, the European Commission was already on that path. They were already thinking about it. But we had a specific resolution also in the European Parliament, basically demanding a specific instrument. The good news is that the European Commission did take that into account, and they came with this proposal of the EU forced labor regulation. So what it specifically will do is to target products. Market surveillance, basically, it's import and export oriented. So inside and outside the European Union, forced labor is forbidden. It will be, in the first instance, a reactive instrument, hopefully on the longer term, a more proactive instrument, because it also needs to learn. We also need to gather data and as much as cases for the European Union, the member states and the Commission to know where it needs to anticipate. But this instrument can be used based on complaints, files that are being submitted on the member state level or the European Commission level. And based on that, investigations can be started and look into products. So the thought behind it is to really finally protect the EU single market of human rights breaches, to protect consumers, of course, because we want to prevent that consumers, that all of us, are buying products that are made by forced labor. And unfortunately, we all are linked with it, unfortunately. Probably something in your house, something in your closet, it's just very hard to prevent it. And this is exactly where the power of the EU and the 27 member states is to do that now together.
That was one of the questions that I'm getting a lot. Maybe you can also explain thoughts about that. So people I confront with exactly what you were just saying, we're probably all in touch with forced labor.
Yeah.
Wow, we live in the Netherlands or in Germany, in Austria, this is all far away. Why bother us with something that is so far away and that we have no leverage on? Wasn't that part of the debate in the EP or also with the Commission?
We can expect that most of the cases will probably be outside the European Union, but we should definitely not underestimate the fact that there is forced labor and also serious forced labor cases within our borders. So what we have said for this regulation is that the EU forced labor regulation and investigations, they can be done by, I hope I'm still there. Yeah. They can be done by the European Commission when it's outside the European Union, and they can be done by the member states when it's inside the European Union. That is a distinction that we make under the EU forced labor regulation. But we also need to be aware of the fact that we are all responsible for fighting against human rights violations. And the fact that forced labor can still happen outside the European Union, inside the European Union, is because consumers still buy these products. And this is the very incentive that you would like to target. So as long as we buy it, as long as it's still a market, it is still a business model, we are contributing to these human rights violations, basically, directly, indirectly. So it's definitely been part of the discussion in the European Parliament. The European Union needs to protect human rights globally, worldwide, and we are not credible if we continue contributing to that. Hence, we need such an instrument to keep these products away from our market.
And that's basically, if I understand the regulation well, how it works. It keeps products out of the market So it is modeled along the model of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which does the same thing. Was that the intention?
Mm-hmm. So in light of negotiating the EU forced labor regulation, we have said that international cooperation, it's also a specific article in the EU forced labor regulation, is very important. So of course we have looked at different countries. Of course we have looked at the United States. I think the United States and the European Union are really one of the best partners to work together and fight forced labor on the global stage. Yes, they have done already very interesting work, and they have a specific act also against products that are made by Uyghur people. And I think what is comparable with the EU forced labor regulation is that we had a whole debate about the problem of state-imposed forced labor. So what the EU forced labor regulation will do is to identify the high-risk geographic areas, the high-risk sectors and products that are also specifically linked to the problem of state-imposed forced labor. And we expect that when these high-risk areas and products are identified, that it can also cause investigations to have priority when we find these products when we think these products are made in these high-risk areas. So it has a different conduct, I'd say, of tackling the issue of state-imposed forced labor, but it's definitely where the different countries and member states together can cooperate.
It's interesting because it takes a different approach from the CSDDD, for example, where risks are flagged but there's no market ban or no ban to enter a certain market. So what makes you believe that this approach is more effective than a more common due diligence approach as in the CSDDD? Why did Parliament choose the ban as the mean for this law?
I think we need to see it complementary. So without the CSDDD, it would probably not be possible to demand this specific instrument. I see them a bit as little sisters. Mm. They are related to each other because you do need to have good due diligence, also to assess the risk of forced labor. So part of the EU forced labor regulation is that investigations will be done, and part of these investigations is that so-called requests to informations will be given to the companies, and part of that is that they will need to answer what kind of due diligence efforts they have been working on, and whether also remediation took place, for example. So they will need to prove and show due diligence efforts, right? And that's part of the CSDDD. It should be a sufficient part of CSDDD, but because of what is happening nowadays in Brussels with the CSDDD, I am of course worried that we would not get very sufficient due diligence efforts, and these are very important for assessing and identifying the risks of forced labor in supply chain. So they are complementary. And what we said in the beginning is that CSDDD is just not enough to specifically target this significant problem of forced labor. So you need to have an extra instrument that is preventing these specific products to enter the EU market. I mean, almost 28 million people are a victim of forced labor, but these are the registered cases. These are the cases that we know about. And the problem with forced labor is also that it's just very, like the ILO says it so well, it's very hard to see often, so it's very hard to count, but we know that it's there. So the effort that we need to put in data and evidence, that's really a high priority. And that's also one of the reasons why we say that the CSDDD needs to be combined with the EU forced labor regulation.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because first of all, I think it's very interesting how the two go together, are supposed to go together. So that's not doubling effort or anything like that, which is something companies very much fear, another regulation with another something on top. But so what is it companies can do? How can they enact this going together of a good risk management system and the EU forced labor ban? So where would you see companies should do the first steps?
Yeah, I think it is very important that companies start to assess and basically start to audit, right? They need to make a very thorough assessment of their supply chain, and they need to work with specific tools and instruments, but specific indicators and metrics, I would say, to identify where the risks are. So traceability is extremely important. I mean, basically the first thing that you need to start doing is tracing and tracking your supply chain and understanding and see where the weak spots are in your supply chain. So, I mean, I had the privilege to speak to so many companies on this topic, and, you know, I see a category of companies who are very successful in traceability, and they basically say, well, you know, between the 98 and 100%, we can know what is happening in our supply chain. And then there's a category of companies that has a lot of difficulties, for example, because they are operating in these high risk regions, for example, where they just don't get a hold, especially not down the supply chain, so they don't get a hold exactly on what is happening in their supply chain. I mean, that nowadays, I'd say, is not an excuse anymore. And if you don't manage to do that, you will need to think about the scenario of responsible disengagement. And I think this is really the main first step that companies need to do. You need to understand your supply chain, and you need to understand your leverage, especially if you're dealing with different kind of suppliers in your supply chain. You need to understand your leverage. You need to understand what you can do with it, who you're working with, and what the risks of it are. These are really the main two, I'd say, important steps in the beginning of this process.
Great, Samira, thank you so much, because that I really like the way you connected basically our buying habits as consumers to what companies have to do. And there is a framework now, but you also made very clear that if companies don't act, nothing will change. There is a heavy responsibility, because forced labor, without any doubt, is one of the worst human rights abuses you can find, and we have a responsibility. So thank you very much. Thank you for your engagement in drafting this law, and thank you very much for explaining it to us so well today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Markus and Samira. And yeah, let's move on now to see exactly how such forced labor risks can be identified. A point that Samira also raised at the very end, and especially in these high pressure environments where the product ban aspect and the market ban aspect of the forced labor regulation really puts these implications on a much higher priority, because it's then no longer a due diligence topic, but really a question of availability of supply. And that's why this high pressure landscape is only increasing. Before we do that, we also wanted to highlight one additional legislative update, which is on the German Supply Chain Act. So this is the LKSG, the German Supply Chain Act. Here, last month, there was an amendment passed to the German Supply Chain Act, and also recent guidance of the Ministry of Economics in Germany towards the enforcement agency has focused the enforcement of the German Supply Chain Act around severe human rights violations. So on the right-hand side here, we see what has changed for the duties covered under the German Supply Chain Act. The main duty that has been removed through the recent amendment is the reporting obligation. And the sanction regime has been refocused on companies not implementing preventive and remedial actions. And here the focus has been further on cases where these actions have not been implemented to mitigate or remediate severe human rights violations. So really a guidance to focus away from, let's say, the broad landscape of human rights into the most severe ones. And let's say there will still obviously be more guidance also from the authorities as to what exactly these severe human rights violations are. But if we look into some of the guidance documentation that has already been issued, for instance, a guidance from the German enforcement agency on the appropriateness of actions. It clearly states that some violations, such as forced labor and other forms of involuntary labor or the worst forms of child labor, are always of high severity. So forced labor, child labor, these can be considered and should be considered as severe human rights violations. What we see here on the left is also the framework for prioritizing action and risks within the German Supply Chain Act, but very much aligns also with the other international frameworks such as the UNGPs, where of course an important dimension to prioritize is the severity of a violation. And this is what the UNGPs also define as the scale, scope, or irremediability of a given violation. And yeah, forced labor certainly can be also considered under these broad international frameworks as severe human rights violations. So that's been a recent refocusing of the German Supply Chain Act, but now going more into the question of what can companies do to identify these forced labor risks in their supply chains, which of course is often a question of finding a needle in the haystack, of identifying risks within tens of thousands of suppliers throughout the supplier network. Here at Prewave, we have been for many years employing here a media screening approach using AI that we have recently, and by that I mean over the last couple of months, refocused also on a more deeper identification, recognition of forced labor indicators worldwide, not just in China, because forced labor is also a global problem. We have additional validation and additional insights on identifying forced labor risks and have, let's say, expanded that into our AI media screening approach. And out of that approach, we have built up a comprehensive database of forced labor indications, which we are now continuously publishing also as alerts on the Prewave system. So this is what our customers see within their supply base, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, whether any indication around forced labor has been identified. But some of these cases we have also made available in a report that we published earlier this year together with Löning, which we will also talk a bit more in depth later throughout the webinar, but where the identification of a forced labor risk is then paired with the in-depth assessment of Löning on the actual severity and indicators that have been met within these cases. More and more of these indications are now published as alerts within Prewave, and that includes, because of the, let's say, important context that is required, not just a link to the sources. When we link to the sources, we pay special attention that we are using sources that do not identify any individuals, but rather broad media coverage or the websites of companies, other reports, often then they are in the local language. We also include then a summary that gives a first reasoning as to why this indication has been published as an alert, and also the initial assessment on the severity of that risk. And that is accessible to Prewave customers. And again, more and more of these cases will come. The important part that is also something that Samira touched upon earlier, is that these forced labor risks typically don't occur on the first tier of the suppliers, but within the deeper supply chain. And this is where we at Prewave also map out supply chains using publicly available data, such as customs data or media data, to identify these supply relationships into the deeper tiers. And we can then highlight these risks also for companies that are occurring in the deeper tiers. From our customers, we receive the first tier, but we can then highlight risks also in the deeper tiers. And I want to finish this first section with a case study. One of the cases that we included in the Modern Slavery and Forced Labor Hotspot report, where, by the way, an updated report will also be published soon. This report was published in March of 2025. The initial alert within Prewave on the company Elec Eltec was published based on combination of evidence we identified from 2015 to 2024. Then, after the publication of the report, together with Löning, we also engaged a dialogue with the affected company. This company was a supplier also to some of Prewave's customers. So a dialogue ensued, and Markus will give a few words on how that process went. That happened then between March and May of 2025. And then in May of 2025, a large media report, an expose, was published in the New York Times, but also the Spiegel, highlighting forced labor in supply chains and also citing this specific company that we also identified here in the report, and linking it to the supply chains of several large organizations. And this shows that while this company is not yet sanctioned, for instance, under the UFLPA, and we don't know whether it will be, still the proactive approach and the proactive identification of risks and indicators helped many of our customers to proactively engage with that case also before it was mentioned on a broader stage. And yeah, maybe Markus, you also want to share a few comments on that case and what we ended up doing to support the remediation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I would like to start by highlighting that forced labor is a risk which is not like other human rights risks in the public impact it has and the kind of pressure it can create. And when we saw that the Spiegel and the New York Times was publishing that, and we had conversations with a few companies that were in touch with companies mentioned in this article, we could feel how much pressure all of a sudden was there. So there's public pressure, there's public attention, there's journalists calling, there's clients calling, there's investors calling, there's even members of parliaments or public investigations are possible. So all of a sudden you are in a situation which is immense pressure. It means immense pressure. And of course, also your business partner, in this case, Elec and Eltec, will also call you and say, hey, what's happening? So I think that this is an important aspect to bear in mind, because once these kind of allegations go public, in whatever way, the pressure rises immensely, and it is very hard to deal with this kind of situation properly. Because what we suggest is to, and that's what we're advocating here, is identify early, and then take a deep breath, talk to Prewave, talk to us, and think how to move forward as long as things are not public, because it means you have possibilities of talking to your supplier, engaging with internal stakeholders. This is usually something that involves the board, the legal department, and others. So it gives you the time to develop a way of dealing with the situation. So takes the time to do some deeper research on what is it that has been mentioned. Is there evidence there? What kind of evidence is there? What is the context? What does it mean in this context? And then also, and that's the third step of this move, is always, what can you do about it? And this is where also what Prewave and our team are doing is we're integrating this really from the identification all the way to understanding it, and then moving on to seeing what is it you can actually do. Is a responsible exit, as Samira was mentioning, the way forward, or is it something else? And in the case of Altic, for example, it was very interesting. Mariana can speak about that because she did the research, that we found a differentiation under the construction of Alec and Elting, which was quite interesting. And we had a very interesting conversation with them. There was we had a video call, and we explained the case. They explained their view. They explained also the organization and where to look at. There's a mother company. There are several subsidiaries under this mother company, and how to differentiate between these. So get a differentiated picture and then take decisions. That's the way forward, I believe. And maybe Mariana, you want to add more specifics on this case and how we worked on it and the things we found.
Yeah, thanks, Markus. Yeah, so for the Altic case was indeed quite interesting. And I think it highlights one of the main challenges we face when in our supporting of business, when we're trying to identify forced labor risks, is that there's a lot of noise, that it's hard to get reliable data, it's hard to get accessible data, and in some cases it might also be by design that it is so, that that the way certain ceremonies or programs are described, or work practices or recruitment practices are described, lead to a challenge in actually being able to say whether that is a forced labor indication or not. And for that, we need to have a very deep knowledge of the context where the situation is taking place. The Altic case was also rather interesting because we came across companies that share a structure. They were their sister companies, but that operated in with different processes in terms of recruitment. And I think this is particular a very useful also finding for companies when it comes to I think somewhat a situation that we do come across as companies ask themselves, what can we do in such a situation? What are the alternatives here? And like an Altic case showed us that there are some possible alternative pathways that can mitigate risks in terms of forced labor. Yeah, I don't know, Markus or Harald, if you would add anything to this, because otherwise we can move forward.
No, I think this case is really a perfect example of how, particularly with forced labor risks, it's important to understand the context and carefully evaluate the actions you take, how to remediate, what the next step and the best possible next step is. And for that, and to explain that approach, also from a broader perspective, yeah, Mariana, I would again like to hand over to you on how we can turn this insight or alert then really into meaningful action.
Amazing. Yes, thank you for that. So some of the experiences I've had when companies receive this kind of alert, or also receive information regarding forced labor risks that might come from different sources, is companies asking themselves, what does that mean for us? What should we do next? So at Löning, our approach to turn insights into action to then help companies plan and implement mitigation measures goes through asking some key questions. So the first one is understanding what happened, understand the facts, go into a deeper in-depth research, understanding of these facts, of what's taking place, what's at stake for our business, how does that relate to how does that impact our business, and what you should do about it, so that companies can then act with confidence, receive clear practical recommendations on how to respond, also in a proportional way to the significance of that risk for their businesses. And by combining then Prewave's early warning system with the alerts with Löning's human rights expertise, you can receive both timely alerts and also this in-depth analysis that is required to act decisively. We can go to the next step. I'd like to take a moment to go a bit deeper into these questions I presented. The first one being what happened. We start in this moment, let's say your company received an alert, and we can support your company, support you in deepening your understanding of the alert. Understand what kind of source it is. What does that mean? That, for example, a certain program or a certain practice was reported at the local newspapers or at company reports, for example. What is the context where that the practice is taking place, and what is the current status? What's the most updated information we have about whether this company, this flagged company, is to engage in these practices? This allowed companies to then understand where this information is coming from and what it indicates. Allows them also to explore the context, this current status, and we can do this through engaging with local experts, but also with supplier dialogue, as we were mentioning earlier, is also as we have already conducted, to triangulate data sources and get a more a broader view of the alert and of the fact that is taking place. And also, very importantly, identify why and how this alert points to a material risk. Why is it that this specific finding, why is it that a company being connected to a certain recruitment agency leads to, for example, to a forced labor risk? In the report that we mentioned earlier, we also have some examples of this in contexts such as Myanmar and Malaysia. And what is really important here is that these signs are not necessarily universal. It's not identifying why a specific practice relates to maybe a causal pathway for risk. Is not a given. It needs contextualized insight. Yeah, can go to the next one, please. Good, thank you. The next question is, okay, we understand what's taking place. You understand why in this context this indicates a forced labor risk, but then you have to ask what's at stake for our business. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? And in this step, we assess how the potential issue connects to your business specifically. You go into your practices or your leverage, your connection to this risk, right? To this target company, for example, how close it is in your supply chain, what leverage you have to influence this flagged company. And we're then able to combine Prewave's assessment and with our own assessment to determine severity and likelihood. We have our own internal methodology based on the UNGP, so it's always UNGP compliant. Again, severity and likelihood that we can also adapt to fit any risk assessment strategies that companies might already have implemented, so that you can also fit this alert into your overarching approach to risk assessment. And a step very important here is also to look inward, which is reviewing the company's existing policies and processes, see what's the management capacity that already exists to respond to this kind of risks. Maybe you have a specific policy for suppliers in that region, or maybe you have a strategy for engagement with stakeholders in a region that you have already identified that is high risk. Maybe you have a specific forced labor policy that applies to your suppliers. All of this needs to be considered to understand the significance of the risk, which will allow us to establish an action plan that gives companies a structured view of really is at stake, but also support companies in making decisions that are proportional and defensible also. If we go to the next one. Thanks, Harold. And yeah, we gather all this information, we assess what it means for your company to finally answer the question, what should I do about it? And the answer to this question will depend on the significance of the risk for a company and the nature of that risk also. Some examples here: for a higher risk, we can might be the case that to go for a strategy to further engage with a supplier. It might be the situation that you have to plan a strategic and responsible disengagement strategy. It might be the case that you have to start engaging on remediation strategies. In other cases, it might be that we go for a monitor pathway or support suppliers in improvement, or for lower risk might lead to the decision to document the rationality to keep on monitoring that risk. We mentioned earlier, and I think it's important to stress, our approach, what Prewave and Löning are going for, is the idea that companies should engage proactively and have time, and allowing companies to have time to engage in dealing with these risks before it becomes a crisis, before it becomes public knowledge, before you get a request from enforcement agency or from or for investors or from reporters, for example. And I want to stress that we have supported companies in both cases where they had received an alert based, for example, on the report that we published earlier this year, and we're able to have a strategy that is longer term, that is more cooperative. And while we have also dealt with cases after they have become public, and it's much more challenging coming to the table with the people that need to come to the table, but also finding good information on which you can build an effective action strategy becomes much more challenging. So I can also stress, I can only stress this, the wins that we get when we're able to act proactively. But of course, if it does come to a crisis, for example, a media report, request from authorities, we have developed a Löning crisis response framework that we're happy to support companies in implementing, where we define a strategy to avoid or stop the harm to human life and dignity, to support internal investigations, but also engage adequately with any external investigations, have a communication strategy to deal with the case, and of course, keep operations viable. And then one last thought. So I think we can then go to the questions. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. We're saying all of this, but even before alerts, as we know, being prepared, building preparedness is the best way to deal with these risks. And we can, at Löning, can also support companies in moving from reacting to risks after they are flagged to anticipating and preventing them. Have different ways. I'm not gonna read all of this. You're gonna receive the material afterwards. But keeping in mind that embedding due diligence practices into everyday business practice is key to make sure that your company is prepared to deal with these risks. By assessing current due diligence systems, we have, for example, conduct this for companies in the energy sector to validate their strategies to deal with buying solar panels, for example, identifying also the risk areas if you're not there yet at this moment, building capacity internally through trainings, identifying and strengthening stakeholder relationships, as well as developing preventive escalation and crisis protocols. These are all some of the services that we can also support companies. And I think we have a next slide for what we can do following up this this webinar. And I also saw some questions here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mariana.
Yeah.
Let me finish up. So I think you learned today a lot about how we can identify forced labor and how also learning can support you in then taking meaningful action on that. What can be next steps after this webinar for you? First of all, read our report. It highlights 10 cases, but it also gives a broader view again on the methodology. It gives a detailed assessment of these cases, gives you also an understanding of the types of assessment you would get from Prewave and Learning on forced labor cases. We will share a link in the mailing after this webinar for you to request the report. If you would like to identify already actively forced labor exposures in your supply chain, using this proactive approach and early warning approach with Prewave, you can also reach out to Prewave. There's many ways, but we'll also have an opportunity in the follow-up email. And last but not least, if you want to learn more about risk response related to forced labor or in general, Learning is there to also support you, and we will also share contact details from the Learning side in the follow-up mailing. And also because the question often pops up, we will share the slides we shared today and the recording also with everybody who signed up for the webinar today. And with that, I would like to thank Mariana and Markus. And now we look at some of the questions. The first question is based on the EU forced labor regulation. What would happen if a company identifies forced labor in its supply chain and the finding is not yet public? Assuming the company manages to end the forced labor in its supply chain, would it have an obligation to inform authorities about the finding and take related products off the market? I can venture an answer here, but I'm not sure, Markus or Mariana, do you want to give it a first go?
Go first, and I can. Yeah.
So generally, EU forced labor regulation prohibits the placing of products onto the European market which were made with forced labor. So the question, of course, is the key part of what the question is identifies forced labor. Is it just an indication for forced labor, or is it proof for forced labor? And that is, of course, where a bit the gray area lies. We certainly take the position at Prewave that an alert we show you based on news or media monitoring is not proof of forced labor. That is exactly where the deeper engagement is needed to confirm the case and assess the case. But if it's a confirmed case, then for the time until you can actually end the forced labor, either by switching to another supplier or with that particular supplier, you would not be allowed to place these products or products made with these components from the supplier onto the European market. But I'm not a lawyer. It's also very important to say. I should have started actually my answer with that. So please check these specific legal questions also with legal advice. Not sure, Markus, Mariana, if you want to add anything to that answer. Yeah.
I would. I am a lawyer, but this is not legal advice. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, because the way that the forced labor regulation is designed, it doesn't add to doesn't have as an obligation for in its design the due diligence, right? You're going to conduct the due diligence, align with the CSDDD, for example, and then you might come across indications of risk. And I think Harald already covered this. We're always talking here about risk. We are not talking about confirmed violations. But in terms, we still need to see how the enforcement is going to be implemented. That's under discussion on the details of this. But interestingly, the duty to identify the forced labor risks, it does not lie with companies in this situation. Like to say, hey, this is a product that was built with forced labor. This has the enforcement bodies will be the commission and some that is still going to be defined at country level. But this is it lies outside of the scope of companies. But if it comes to it, the idea is that if it comes to a certain product being identified, being flagged by these enforcement authorities as being built with forced labor, having the due diligence, having the information, for example, we have already engaged with the supplier when we can confirm that this problem has been addressed. This can be informed to the authorities that will then consider this in their process of assessing whether the product can come in or not to the market. So having information at hand can be really useful to make sure that a process like this moves expeditiously. That's what we know at this moment.
Thank you, Mariana. There is one question.
Could I add something?
Yeah, please, Markus. Please.
I think it's important that we're talking about the law, which is obviously important. But if you're looking at these kind of risks, you should also look at other risk factors that are the risk in the sense of risk to the company in this case. You should also be aware that others are also looking at that. So if how good is the scrutiny, for example, of your shareholders? What do they expect you to do? Just as one example, how do you deal with the situation that this would become public? You have to take all of this into account. I think it's not enough to simply, or it's the first step to say, how can we comply with the law? That's important. But take these other risks to the company, in this case, also into account when you move forward.
Absolutely. And maybe tying that into one of the questions here, Prewave uses AI and public sources only to identify risks? Are there other sources? So yes, we rely on publicly available sources. That can be media, that can be social media. We also look into social media like TikTok or Douyin, as it's called in China, but really global sources. And here the point is also connecting to what Markus just said, is that data, of course, is, since it's public information, that is also looked at by other parties. Is it NGOs? Is it potentially enforcement agencies? Is it also other providers of such data and research? Is it journalists? So this idea of understanding which companies in my supply base are linked, you want to really know that as soon as possible. Again, not because all of these indications are proof points, but really as a way for you also to then start engaging and prioritizing to take appropriate actions in relation to these risks, so that you're not under the pressure of then having to reactively respond after, let's say, a media expose is published.
A very important point.
Maybe a question also to Mariana on relating it a bit to the report. Is the summary only based on the Asian countries indicated in your report, therefore not really applicable to other geographical areas where risks may differ?
Yes. Just to make sure I'm understanding here that you mean that the person is asking is referring to the summary in the report. And we come from international standards based on the ILO, of course, who's the organization that has the final say, I would say, in these matters. But for every assessment, as we do internally at Löning, for every assessment of findings in different countries, we will assess severity and the likelihood based on the specific context. So we do have a general introduction in the report where we are talking about international standards of and indicators of forced labor. But for the assessment of severity and likelihood of each finding of each company, we always consider the specific context of that company. Where is it taking place? Also, what's the sector? And this can always be expanded, for example, to countries, let's say in Latin America or in Africa also. The key point is that, for example, Brazil has a legislation on forced labor that it's more encompassing than some international standards, and it would consider that to assess the risk. So this is the kind of work that we do, not only looking at the finding, but what does the finding look in that specific context.
And in the upcoming report, we also want to focus not just on the Asian countries of China, Myanmar, and Malaysia, but also broadening the scope, because forced labor is not just an Asian topic. It's linked into many, especially raw material supply chains globally. Yeah. Markus, sorry.
If I can add, so the third step, which is the what can we do step, of course, heavily depends on where are you? Where was the forced labor risk identified or the evidence found? And that defines what you can do. So we have seen cases, for example, of forced labor in the UK, also in other European countries, where you have a different situation. It's possible to work with law enforcement, for example. You have countries where, in theory, you can work with law enforcement, but maybe law enforcement is weak. And you have countries where we're talking about state-imposed forced labor. And there are many countries, because state-imposed forced labor, for example, also takes place in prisons. In those cases, for example, you cannot work with law enforcement, or it doesn't make sense to work with them. So the context very much defines the possibilities to act and end the risk.
A very important question here, forced labor, how important is it for the EUDR, so for the deforestation regulation? And at its surface, the deforestation has nothing to do with forced labor, but in the EUDR, there's a second component on risk factors around compliance with local legislations that anchors many human rights and environmental topics into the EUDR. And obviously, most countries in the world do not sanction or forced labor is outlawed, right? So that is covered. Therefore, actually, forced labor is a criteria for the EUDR. And if forced labor is identified and confirmed, that is also a risk that would, let's say, trigger the EUDR criteria for not being able to import products under that regulation as well. So yeah, it is actually very important, not just for EUDR, but in many other regulations as well. Yeah. Markus, do you want to answer still one question?
I clicked on the wrong thing here. Sorry.
No worries. The two questions related to Prewave. I think one question is what data is required for Prewave to map the tier N supply chain? Are HS codes required for the purchases made from the suppliers so that Prewave can map the tier N supply chain, or are E-classes sufficient? So neither HS codes or E-class or any kind of classification is required. It just makes the mapping more accurate if you can supply it. Meaning, if we know that this is a supplier where you are buying certain industrial goods from or certain raw materials from, that means we can focus the deeper supply chain around the materials necessary for what you are buying from that supplier. That means we are focusing more and we are highlighting less irrelevant risks in the deeper supply chain. So to the extent customers have that, we use it, but it's not a requirement to get started in that sense. And another question that is the full LKSG risk analysis possible with Prewave, not just forced labor? Yes, forced labor is an important part, but the risk analysis for the LKSG can be done for all of the relevant risk factors. Yeah, since there are no more questions and we are 2 minutes after 6 o'clock, I think we can end the webinar today, and I would like to thank Mariana and Markus for joining and preparing today. I think this is a very important topic and will certainly not have been the last webinar on this topic together. And yeah, thank you. And not sure, Markus, if you want to say the final words for today.
Well, thank you very much, Harald, for setting this up and also for developing the technology that allows all of this. I think this is really a major step forward. Like the combination of what's possible out there technology-wise with the knowledge of the context, that will give companies the tool to not only know what they have, but understand it and then act on that and bring risks down. And I think that's great. That's a major step forward in the fight against forced labor here.